welcome to H360 Health Talk. I'm here this afternoon with a good friend, Tim Duffy, who is the founder and president of a really great organization called One Soldier, One Dog, One Team. And it's a really important foundation that Tim has started. We're going to hear all about that. Tim has a real interesting background, starting out as a Navy man and then a firefighter in New York City, and now running the foundation that he's built, again called One Soldier, One Dog, One Team. We're going to hear all about that. So Tim, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So Tim, we had a chance to chat over lunch, and you certainly have a very eclectic and exciting history. But as a young man, you decided to join the Navy, and tell me a little about that. What kind of got you into the Navy mode?
The family situation, there was no way that the family could put me through college, and I wasn't a good student where I was getting a scholarship. And my dad worked in Manhattan, took the train, the ferry every day, and wore a suit and a tie, and that was just something that I was more in the garden with my nana doing the tomatoes and taking care of the animals. So I knew that I wasn't going to get to college and all, but I knew I needed something solid to move me forward. I had really no direction, and I knew I needed an education, and a buddy of mine suggested that we go into the Air Force together in the buddy program. So I had an Uncle Paul that was at the time a master sergeant in the Air Force, and I called up my Uncle Paul and I told him what I was thinking about doing, and he asked me, he said, "Tim, why do you want to join the military?" And I told him I needed an education of some sort. I wanted to travel the world, and I wanted to get the F out of New York. So he said, "Son, join the Navy." He was stationed in Minot, North Dakota for 4 to 6 years, and those kinds of places, which is not really what I was looking for. I really wanted to get out and see the world.
But when you were a young man and you were starting to think about a life in or serving the country, you really wanted to be a Marine, is that right?
I did, and I went to the recruiting office. I wanted to fly helicopters for the Marines, and they wouldn't let me because I had a busted eardrum. And then that's when my buddy, he tried to talk me into the Air Force thing, but the Navy guy had gotten in my ear. When I tried to leave the office, he came running after me. "Kid, where you going?" And he got in my ear, and that's why when Uncle Paul said join the Navy, I called the chief back, and I just, they put me through engineering school, and I got this, I climbed Mount Fuji when I was in Japan, and I had my own darkroom at the time and a couple of Nikons, and I would, not that I didn't drink beer and that kind of stuff as a sailor, but I when we would go to these far-reaching places, I would pack up a couple of PB&J sandwiches in my little backpack in my camera bag, and I would just truck around wherever I was, the Philippines, Japan, Australia, and take pictures. I wanted to see the world, and I did.
So what was your job in the Navy? So you go through boot camp, I assume, right? And then you get assigned a job.
Yeah, I was a gas turbine mechanical engineer. Back in the late 70s, they had this really great idea to take DC-10 jet engines and put them on some of the smaller ships as main propulsion. And when I signed up in 78, it wasn't even in the catalog. But I scored really good on the test, and they wanted me to go into the nuclear program, and I told them to kiss my Royal Irish butt. That wasn't happening. If the boat goes down, I at least need a standing chance to swim, and that ain't happening underwater. So I went and wound up on the FFG-10, the USS Duncan, and did 2 years on there and traveled the world. I was lucky.
Now, how many years did you spend in the Navy?
Just about 4, yeah.
About 4.
I had gotten in a little bit of trouble. I had a friend that got killed, and by the name of Michael Rubel, and it's public record, and it's so long ago I don't mind talking about it. But he was a radio man, and he was assigned the task of burning top secret material. Well, we had a small incinerator on the ship. It was a small boat. We only had 168 guys, and everybody knew everybody. And we had told the chief engineer to shut down the incinerator because the cooling valve was faulty. He didn't want to do that because it would go out to the fleet that we had a faulty incinerator. We were the #1 frigate in the 7th Fleet. So he didn't shut it down. And they sent Michael down there to burn all this material, and it blew up and blew his head off. And I had to actually climb over his body to put the fire out. And at the time, we didn't have fire suits. I mean, I was in jeans and a T-shirt, basically. And, he didn't make. He was alive, barely. We were in the Sea of Japan, and they flew him off, but he didn't make it. But what really messed me up was that the Navy actually told his family that it was his fault because he overstuffed the incinerator. So they kind of hid it and washed it and blamed it on him when it was their fault. And I got in some trouble speaking up about it. And so they wound up, they got me to, they asked me if I would be happy if they gave me an honorable discharge, and I told them I'm not looking to get out of the Navy. I don't want out of the Navy. And the XO just looked at me and says, well, would it make you happy if I gave you an honorable discharge? And so within 8 days...
The writing was somewhat on the wall.
Within 8 days I was out of the Navy with an honorable discharge.
So you get out of the Navy, and then what's the next step in your career?
I went to, I was in California on the beach, so I went to the unemployment office. I wanted a job, and I went in, and there was a one-legged World War II vet at the desk, and he had, fill this out, you get a check in 2 weeks. So I just sat there, and I didn't move, and he looked up, and he said, did you hear me? I said, well, maybe you don't understand why I'm here. I want a job. I don't want your money. And he was taken aback. He made some phone calls, and the first interview he sent me on was an electrical company that they were from Staten Island, New York, and the Petersons. And there were 4 boys, 2 girls, just like my family. It was kind of weird. And they asked me if I knew anything about electrical work, which I knew very, very little because I was a mechanical engineer, not electrical, but I knew very little. But I told them, sure. And I just figured, how hard can it be? It's 2 or 3 wires. I'll figure it out, right? So he hired me, and I was a little nervous about it. But then he says, look, my brother, who was the vice president, they had a contract with CalFed Banks. We were changing out the tellers, the computer systems in the banks for California Federal and Wells Fargo. He says, we're doing a bank downtown LA tomorrow, and my brother needs a hand. So I threw right away, will you work on a weekend? So I'm thinking, who better to learn from than the boss, right? Sure, I'll work. And within 6 months, I was a foreman. And until I left the state and came back here. And then I kind of stayed in that business. My father hooked me up with a guy who hooked me up with a guy. And I wound up, my first job in Manhattan was, they were building the Palladium on 14th Street, and I put the phone system in there. I wired it up. And then after a couple of years of that, I started my own little phone business and wound up working for, some city organizations, the Housing Authority, Taxi and Limousine Commission I had contracts with, and some movie stars and rock stars, and I was doing pretty well. And then I had always I was a fireman when I was in, and then when I took the test here in the city to be a fireman, the pay was so horrible, there was no way I could, get established to get married and have kids with that, so I turned it down.
Tim, what year was that?
This had to be in the late 80s, probably 88-ish, 87, 88, somewhere around there.
Yeah, so you go to take the fireman test.
Yeah.
And you passed the test.
I passed it and turned it down.
Yeah.
And then, so I probably took it the first time, probably in around 83, 84. And then I took it again and later on in the 80s.
So you keep doing your phone work.
I was working and trying to build so that I could be a fireman. And then the third time I took the test, I got 100 on the test, then 100 and 100. And I was very high on the list. I was one of the first called. So at that point, my mortgage was only $350 a month. I had now, I already was married and had a kid. And so I took it the third time. Yeah. And I went to the academy in 95.
So you get out of the academy and you're assigned to what house?
Stevie Siller and I from the Tunnel to Towers. We went to Broadway School together. And we got sent to the first firehouse together, 153 truck in Coney Island Avenue and Avenue U in Brooklyn, in Gravesend, Brooklyn. Right, just up a little bit from the actual Coney Island.
Now, when you get out of the academy and you're assigned to a house, you obviously you get to the house and you're working your way up the pecking ladder, so to speak.
Yeah.
So as a young firefighter just out of the academy, what kinds of things are you expected to do when you get calls, and what's your role there?
Keep your mouth shut and get in a sink. You're not part of the crew yet. They let you know when you're a real part of the crew. Your job is to make sure the rig and the tools are in tip-top shape. So the first thing you do when you come in is you go over the rig, you start the saws, you start the hearse tool, you make sure if there's anything we're going to need that it's working. And that's your number one priority. Once you finish that, then you're in the sink. If there's any dishes or pots or, if the bathroom needs to be cleaned, you're starting at the bottom. And You just work your way up, and the guys will give you tasks to do in the firehouse. As you start, they'll put more on you and more on you, more responsibility and all that. And they're also teaching you. The good senior men will come out and grab you with a tool and say, this is how we do this or that, and so it's just a total learning experience. I was older, and I had, some Navy firefighting experience, so it was a little bit easier for me than some of the guys.
Yeah.
But again, I was in the top echelon, the top classes, the first classes off the list, so I was with Chris Iser, who's a chief now, and Jonathan Ielpi, Chris Bopp. I mean, there were 17 guys in my squad, and there's only 6 of us still alive. Like we were the top guys. The Feehan's son, the commissioner's son at the time, the chief of department, his son sat behind me. Johnny Feehan was also in my. It was just filled with all the chief sons and all the guys that knew the job that the test was easy for.
Yeah.
So I was just in with the cream of the crop.
So how long are you at that house?
I did a year there, and then they came up with a policy. They wanted guys to experience different areas of the city.
Yeah.
So they sent me. I did a year there, and then they sent me to 7-engine, one truck downtown Manhattan, Duane and Broadway. I did a year there, and then they sent me to Staten Island in an engine, 166 engine, 86 truck for a year.
And what's the idea of sending you around? And is the city? I know the city's big, obviously, and then you've got the boroughs. Are there different ways that you fight fires in different areas of Manhattan?
Yeah, absolutely. In Brooklyn, with a 3-story walk-up, the OV is going to the rear and coming in that back bedroom as they're bringing the line in the front door, because in most of, even in here, the bedrooms are always in the rear.
Yeah.
The living room and all that stuff is up front. So in Manhattan, the OV takes the elevator, because you can't get to the rear on something that's over 4 or 5 stories.
Sure. Yeah.
So how you attack fire is different in a private dwelling as opposed to a storefront. So you just learn so many different things by being in different areas.
So you're doing the rotations, and
Yeah.
so you go from one to the next and,
Yep.
and back, and then did you find one? So let me ask you: Are the houses, the personalities of the houses and the things different from house to house, or are you running into the same group of guys?
Well, it's almost like one friend said to me. He said the only thing that's going to change are the faces. You're always going to get that one jerk. You're always going to get the guys that are always doing more than. You're always going to get the guy that's like the father that's going to teach. There's always. It seems like the characters are almost the same. It's just different people doing those jobs. Because it is a brotherhood and it's a family, the firehouse, and you got to know your place. And the only way you move up is by doing. And I remember one of the old timers telling me, because I was always a doer. I wasn't one for sitting around, with fixing this or building this or doing this. And he told me, he says, Duffy, he says, you can't fuck up unless you step up.
Yeah.
And the point was that you're only going to make a mistake if you're trying,
Right.
and that's okay,
Right.
because we'll teach you.
Yeah.
And that that was kind of my mentality. I just had that mentality. I'm a tool guy. I can do anything with my hands. And
Now, Tim, is there one house or one circumstance at one of the houses that stands out in your mind more than the others, whether it be, going into a situation where you're saving a lot of people, or tell me about that.
Yeah, it wasn't long after Proby School. It was before 9/11. One of the guys that sat next to me in Proby School, he was a cop before he came to us, Chris Bopp. He died in a fire with 2 other guys. He was at 170 truck in Canarsie, and that really got me, because we were pretty close, and he was just a great guy, and he had just gotten married, and that hit me pretty hard when I went into the firehouse and went into the house watch, and the guys would tell me, "Yeah, we had a bad fire last night, and we lost a couple of guys." And when I found out it was Chris, that was really the first time I lost somebody close on the job. And it was, I think it was in 97 or 98, so I was still new to the job, and to lose him like that was pretty tough, because he was just an outstanding fireman. He was just an outstanding guy, and that hurt. There's a million stories, but that was one of the first, so that kind of stuck with me for the longest time.
So Tim, you're moving up in the ranks, and then we wake up one morning on September 11th, 2001, to one of the world's greatest tragedies.
Yeah.
And you, being a firefighter in New York City, where were you that morning? And talk to me about some of the events that took place right after the plane hit the tower.
I was actually doing a tune-up on my motorcycle, and I was actually pulling the first spark plug out when I heard a loud boom. And it sounded like it was behind me in Jersey. I lived on the beach near the Verrazano Bridge, and I could see the Trade Center from my kitchen window. And so I just kept, motoring, but I noticed that after the 20 seconds of sirens, that the sirens never stopped. There was just a cascade of sirens. So I knew something bad happened with us. I went into the house to call the firehouse to see what was going on. And as I reached for the phone rang, and I picked it up. It was my wife dropping off the kids at daycare and at the Y. And she said, a plane just hit the Trade Center. So I turned to my left, and I saw the North Tower burning. So I was like, honey, I gotta go. And she's like, you're not working today? You don't have to go? And I was like, no, honey, I'm pretty sure I gotta go. And she's trying to keep me on the phone, the whole you're not working. And the other plane wound up hitting it, and I just told her, I'll talk to you later. And I hung up. I ran outside. I actually grabbed a Dead Guy t-shirt, and like what he's wearing. And so I put the other spark plug in, and I took off, and I was pretty much on the sidewalk. I got to the firehouse. Everything was shut down. So I got to the firehouse in Brooklyn, Coney Island Avenue U, 153, 254 engine. And I was standing next to my buddy, Jimmy Falcone, who was on the phone with his sister who worked in the South Tower. And I could hear him telling her, she was bugging out. And I could hear her telling him, calm down, just, get a shirt or a sweater or a towel and put it under the door. And, all guys are on their way up to get you, SOP, that's what you do in a high-rise fire.
Yeah. So
he hangs up the phone, and literally 4 or 5 minutes later, we're standing there and watching the TV, and the South Tower fell. Well, Jimmy freaked. I just killed my sister, and it was a bad moment. He ran out and grabbed the first cabbie and ripped the guy out of the cab and took the cab. And I know he didn't get too far because everything was just shut down. So I went to the boss, and I just told him, I said, listen, boss, I'm gonna follow Jim. I got the bike. You guys are stuck here. He was waiting for orders. Guys were coming in, and he was waiting for orders on what to do, where to go. And so I told him I'd meet him up in the city. I was jumping on the bike, and he grabbed me by the arm, and his name was Mike Joyce, a Vietnam veteran, and he came. We got him from 3 Truck, Pat Brown. He was really good friends with Pat Brown, and he grabbed me by the arm, and he looked at me with a very sullen, solemn look, and told me to stick with him. I would drive him, and he told me to stay with him because we were going to lose hundreds of men today. And I had a respect for him, and I loved the guy. I didn't say anything, but in my head I was thinking, you crazy old fart, I'll see you later. But I kind of felt bad what the spot I put him in, just mentally, that here I was heading out, and he knew, but anyway, I jumped on the bike, and I went up Ocean Parkway, up the middle, and I got to the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, and everything was shut down. And the cops wouldn't let me in the tunnel, so I got back on the sidewalks and went over the Brooklyn Bridge. And when I got off the Brooklyn Bridge is when Alan Tannenbaum snapped that shot of me on the bike.